Welcome to the Baby Sleep Connection, a podcast that explores baby sleep and more through the lens of attachment and development. I'm your host, Heather Boyd. I'm a mom of 3, an occupational therapist, and a certified infant and family sleep specialist. If you are a tired parent who wants to support your baby sleep holistically, keep listening as we delve into approaches that go well beyond the usual strategies of wake windows and bedtime routines. Your baby's sleep is connected with so much more. The spring forward time change is coming up. It's only in a few days. And I know as a parent of babies, this time change and the other one that happens in the fall really worried me. I would be worried about the impact it had on our routine and rhythm. I'd be worried about the timing of bedtime. And I know I wasn't alone. I think most parents really get concerned about how this spring forward, which means instead of bedtime looking like it's at 7 o'clock, it is now 8 p.m. A lot of parents are worried. So let's break down how you can be less worried by taking the action that you can to make this easier. And you may be surprised by how little action you actually need to take. Let's go through 3 of the approaches that you could take to manage this spring forward, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. For those in the Southern Hemisphere, it's going to be the opposite. I certainly prefer the fall back. It feels like I have this extra hour of the day. But let's break this down. First, I want to point out that this time change is very arbitrary, right? We made it up. We decided to have time changes. I wish we didn't. I know there's always discussions every year about abolishing this time change. I would love to see it. It's hard on our bodies. It's hard on our rhythm. But this is the reality. We live in a world where in most places there is a time change. And your options are quite simple. Either do nothing at all, plan ahead and prep that bit of a 1-hour time change over the course of a few days or a week, or react to it after and adapt deliberately after. Now, even within that, you have a choice on either doing it really fast, like pulling off a Band-Aid, or doing it nice and slowly. And we'll go through the pros and cons of all of that. But the key point, regardless of what method you take, that I want you to hold on to is that no matter what you do, whether it's do nothing, do something ahead of time, or react to the time change after, everything will be all sorted out, likely within the week. So no matter what you do, you're going to be back in sync with the clock within the week. So this is not a huge life-altering decision. This is relatively minor, but feels big. So let's talk about doing nothing. Now we know that sleep is driven by sleep pressure and circadian rhythm. And so we know that circadian rhythm is largely tied to sunshine, right? The sun comes up in the morning and sets at night. The wavelengths that sunlight gives us impacts the hormones in our body. Melatonin starts rising in the evening and cortisol starts rising in the morning. And that's what allows us to have this circadian rhythm where we're drawn into sleep in the evening, as long as we don't have a lot of things interfering with that. And we're drawn out of bed in the morning, as long as we've had at least some sleep that we can not be exhausted, which I know for many of you is not the reality because of interrupted sleep supporting your baby. With the do nothing approach, you're just going to carry on life as if nothing has happened, right? You may change the clocks. I suggest eventually changing the clocks. But for those of you who are at home with your baby, not particularly tied to a lot of scheduled things that require the clock, like daycare drop-offs, school pickups, work, meetings, appointments, play groups. If your babies are really little, do nothing can kind of work, because as long as you know when you really do need to meet up with that friend at the park or for a coffee or get to the dentist on time, they're really, for that first period of time where you're at home with your baby, there may not be a lot of really tied to the clock schedule things that you have. With do nothing, you're still going to be impacted by the world around you, because meals will still happen. Those occasional dentist appointments will still happen. You'll at some point need to change your clocks. I realize so many of our clocks now change automatically, so you don't even have to do that. I still remember earlier cars that I've had where the effort to try to change the clock in those cars, it took like a PhD in electronics to figure out how to change it. Now, most of them change on their own. So it's a rare device where you actually have to do that work. I think the stove is probably one of them, the microwave, and I do have an analog watch that I do have to change. So when you do nothing, you're basically just gradually adapting to the new change because of the pressures around you that are related to time. And there is this word that I use this time of year and during the fallback. It's a fun word. I've never actually heard someone say it verbally, so I may be pronouncing it wrong, but the word is zeitgeber. And what a zeitgeber is a rhythmically occurring phenomenon that cues your body to circadian rhythm. Now, some definitions say that it's a naturally rhythmically occurring phenomenon. I personally like to include some of the other rhythmic things that happen in our life. So what are these zeitgebers and how does it help our circadian rhythm? Well, the most powerful zeitgeber, so the most powerful rhythmically occurring phenomenon that helps us stay in sync with circadian rhythm is light. That sun coming up in the morning and sun setting in the evening. Of course, the lights in our house impact that as well, but let's assume we're talking about sunshine as a cue. The second and third most powerful zeitgebers are meal times and alarms. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about alarms because for those of you with really young babies who are not on a work schedule, alarms are probably not part of your day. For those that have really strong circadian rhythms and you're able to manage getting up at a consistent time, or your babies are sleeping well enough that you can be in sync with your circadian rhythm to go to bed and wake up, alarms probably don't play much of a role. So let's talk about the zeitgeber of meal times. Meal times tend to happen at consistent times, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They tend to be really powerful cues for the start of the day. Like we get up, we have our morning routine that includes setting the breakfast table or making coffee and sitting down for a meal. And the dinner meal is a cue of the things that are unfolding for bedtime routine. So light and meals are the ones I want to focus on. If you're not going to do anything, what you can still do is go outside. At this time of year, when there is a time change, because right now I'm noticing that it is lighter earlier in the morning, but when we have the time change, what is bright at 7 a.m. is now going to be that bright at 8 a.m. So we're not going to be able to rely on the morning sunshine quite as well as we have been leading up to this time change. Of course, the opposite is happening in the evening because what was reasonably bright at 7 is now 8 o'clock. So it is staying brighter later after the time change. When we go outside, though, when that sun is up, it triggers our body to be as in sync with that sunlight as possible. That evening sun is good as well because it is changing in wavelength to help support that switch to melatonin. So if you do nothing, you can still use the sun. You will still have meal times that may eventually morph or shift into the new timeline because there are other pressures. You might have a spouse who's working who will still get home at 5:30, even though it's the new 5:30, and that was a time that used to be 4:30, but you can honor those two most powerful zeitgebers. I will say as well, with mealtimes and young children, we as adults can often adapt to a little bit of a delay or eating a mealtime a little bit early because we're adaptable that way. Kids aren't as adaptable. So you may need to keep an eye on, yes, the clock says this, but their body will be saying, no, it's mealtime or it's not mealtime yet. I'm either really hungry or I'm not hungry yet. Because dinner that used to be at 5 p.m., we bumped the clocks forward and it's now 6 p.m. Well, that feels too late for dinner, but their bodies still think it's 5 p.m. So keep an eye on mealtimes not really feeling in sync with the routine. For a bit, it may take a few days to get in sync, and that is okay. So let's talk about the prep ahead approach. This is when you take a few days to a week ahead of time to gradually shift things towards the new time. What that means is starting to offer things earlier, because what was 7 in the morning is going to be 8, and you don't want to start your day at 8. You want to start it at 7 when the clocks change. So you're going to gradually, in like 15-minute increments every day or 2 or 3, shift everything forward a little bit. That's enough to start moving towards what that new time will be without really doing a dramatic change. As again, we work with patterns, right? We have circadian rhythm, we have other rhythms. We're used to being hungry at certain times. And so a little bit of a change, offering meal times a little bit earlier, offering bedtime a little bit earlier, waking up a little bit earlier. Maybe you do set an alarm, especially if you have lots tied to the clock, to get you up and started 15 minutes earlier. By a week in, everything is sorted and you're back in sync. Your kids and you have adapted and you can move on with the springtime and the chirping birds and the crocuses that are starting to poke up out of the ground. The last option, the third one, is to react after. And that may happen when it sneaks up on you, you didn't realize it was going to be the time change, or you just didn't have anything in you to be able to adapt ahead of time. And reacting after is about switching the clocks to the new time, but being very graceful about this shift not happening dramatically. Take your time with it. Note the time, but remind yourself that just a couple of days ago, it was actually only 4 o'clock, not 5, or it was actually only 7 p.m., not 8. It's helpful, especially at bedtime, when we think that our babies are going to be overtired and are going to bed way too late because it says 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Their bodies are still working on the old time because they're in sync with everything that was laid out with that pre-spring forward time. So have some grace and flexibility with the fact that their bodies are not going to be telling them it's sleep time. Use those zeitgebers, use sunshine, use meal times to help with the adaptation, but don't trick yourself into thinking that it's catastrophically late for them, because it really isn't, not inside their bodies. This is just by the clock. Again, the clock is arbitrary. We've made up these times. We've made up this whole time shift. So understand that it's our bodies that are driving most of when we eat and when we go to sleep and when we wake up. Now, I said there were 2 other options too, whether to do it really fast and pull off the Band-Aid or do it slow. Fast is hard. Like 1 hour time change isn't nothing. We know that drivers tend to be more exhausted. Accidents have a little bit of a peak after a time change when we've lost an hour. We know that there are health implications with an hour. It's only an hour, and yet there are implications. So I tend not to opt for the do it fast unless you really get caught all of a sudden with realizing there's been a time change and you're supposed to be on the road. That happened to us last year, actually. You'd think as a sleep coach, I would know when the time change was happening. But we were planning a March break trip. We were going to get up at 4 a.m. to get a good go on the day. We decided, my teenage son and I, to go out to a concert to see a friend play the night before. So we were up way past my usual bedtime. We were getting home at like 11:30 or midnight before the time change, which means it was actually 1 o'clock with the new time, with the spring forward. And instead of leaving at 4 o'clock, we realized that that was going to actually be to our bodies 3 o'clock. And so we had way less sleep than we expected. I think I slept in the car the whole way. My spouse did all the driving. And again, within a few days, we adapted with meal times and we changed our clocks. We got there. Thankfully, it was actually vacation, so the timing could be a little bit softer. Generally, I suggest doing it slowly. You don't even have to, because as a young parent, when I heard this 15-minute thing, change everything 15 minutes, that seemed like a lot of clunky work to me. Like I had to constantly be thinking about 15 minutes earlier for everything. We don't even have to be that rigid or deliberate about it. We can just look at the time, note that we don't have to be sticklers about it unless it's an actual appointment, and know that if we know when dinner is and we just make sure that we're offering it a little bit earlier leading up to the time change, getting that table set a little sooner or starting dinner prep a little earlier, that's all that's really needed. The 15 minutes is like a nice increment, but it's still a pain in the butt, I think, in terms of trying to work really hard on this. So if you're feeling like, gosh, this feels like a real technical mess of trying to get everything 15 minutes earlier, know that it doesn't have to be that deliberate. It just has to be thinking about, let's start everything a little bit earlier so that by the time the time change happens, we're actually not doing so badly. All in all, though, the key piece here is to know that no matter what method you choose, no matter what approach you take, you're all going to be back in sync within a week, and those crocuses will be popping up in the garden anytime now. Thank you for joining me on this episode, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I do hope that you found the information and perspectives in this podcast episode helpful to you as you navigate your baby's sleep development. Of course, this podcast provides general information and it isn't tailored to your family's reality or the specific needs of your baby. If you're concerned about your baby's sleep or health, be sure to reach out to your healthcare provider. If you're feeling exhausted and overwhelmed and you need a place to feel nurtured and reassured, you can find me on Instagram at familysleep.ca. Until next episode, look for the connections that support you and your baby.